happy to present to you all today. And our mission really is to, in really simplified words, is to connect people to nature and our local environment. So we're going to do that today by talking about how to build basins, because when you get your hands in the dirt, you're really connecting to nature, and you're going to see all sorts of new worlds open up to you as you learn all about rainwater harvesting. So this class is being offered as part of our BYOB community swap. So I just wanted to do a little introduction to that when we start, but then we're going to get into a lot more detail at the end of this workshop about how that all works. But essentially, we are inviting the community to attend these Build Your Own Basin virtual workshops, and then you qualify to get a BYOB kit. Thanks to some sponsors and donated materials from other community members, we're able to provide a kit to get you started on your own basin. So we'll be again talking about all the details of that towards the end of this, but having shown up today, you qualify for that, and hopefully this class will help you know what to do with that kit when you take it home. We can move slides. Amber or Lauren, feel free to chime in as I'm presenting if there's questions that come up in the chat that need to be addressed in a timely manner. Happy to take those.
Yeah.
So
I did want to mention, sorry, Lisa. Yeah, definitely post all of your questions in the chat. We can definitely make the slides available. I believe this presentation is quite long. It might have to be a PDF, but we can definitely figure out how to send those to you, Heather. And we will have a Q&A at the end of this workshop. So definitely post your questions in the chat, and Amber will answer as she is able to, or give a shout out to you. But we will have a Q&A at the end as well.
Thanks, Lauren. All right, so I did show this a little bit earlier, but we have this BYOB zine, and if you don't have a copy or you haven't seen the version online, you definitely can get one when you stop by the Living Lab. We have lots of extra copies. So this outline follows what's in that guide, so it will be reinforcing everything that you'll get to take home later. I have been building basins for about 15 years, many in my own yard, many at other people's homes, everything from really small basins to really large large scale basins and everything in between. So I'm going to share some of my knowledge, and then Lauren's going to be sharing as well, because a lot of these photos are from her yard, a little basin project that was done the last year. And Amber is also going to be sharing some of her personal stories around basins, because this is really about your journey with building basins in your yard or in your neighborhood, and it's a learning process for all of us. So we're happy to share what we know. So we've got 8 steps we're going to cover today. Observing the rain. So we already started talking about a little bit. That's how you really get to know what's happening in your yard. Choosing your basin location, digging your basin, planning for overflow, creating gentle slopes, planting like nature, adding mulch, and then observing and adjusting. So let's go ahead and get started. So observing the rain. We can go ahead and skip to the next. So we did get some rain this winter and spring. Hopefully you got a chance to get out and see some of that. Here's a photo of rain along Dodge. So along the street next to WMG's Living Lab and Learning Center. Pretty much whenever it rains, I'm running outside, whether I'm here at the Living Lab or at home or wherever else, I'm going to get outside and see what's going on. I think a lot of us have that tendency in the desert to get out and enjoy the road. Definitely get out and do that next time it rains. Get out and observe what's happening in your yard. So just looking at this photo here, you can see that there's some water pooling and moving along what's called the right-of-way. So this landscape right next to the street. We have landscaped this in a very specific way to collect the rain, and so it is such that the water moves straight into the land area. But that's necessarily how landscapes are graded, that the house you might have purchased or the street you're on may not be graded that way. It probably is not. So one of the things that you'll be learning to do is to observe these and then make changes in how the earth is graded to collect that water. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So just a little sketch here of some of the basic elements of a passive rainwater harvesting system. And passive is what everything we're talking about today. An active system would be like a rainwater tank. But collecting what passively moves off surfaces. So in this example, the house, it's showing the roof. So that's the collection area that water is coming on. It's being conveyed in a swale feature here, that's 2. And then it's moving into a basin where it's being infiltrated into the soil. So you're actually capturing the water in the earth, in the soil. It's moving into the soil and the water is being stored in the soil. Go ahead to the next slide.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
Okay, this is Lauren's yard, so she's on.
So I did this project with another staff member that we have, Joaquin Murrieta, who is our cultural ecologist, and he came with me to my backyard and helped me through this process. So I'm just going to talk to you all a little bit about what I did in my backyard. And so these 2 arrows on this photo that you can see are what I observed in my backyard. And so this first arrow is kind of where we want the water to go. And this arrow right here is where the water was going. So off in this picture right over here is one of our gates. And so we had, like, when it rained, and it rains, we had a massive puddle with it was so muddy. We couldn't walk through our gate unless we really wanted to kind of swim and get ourselves all dirty. And so we really wanted to avoid that. And so we wanted the water to go this way, away from the gate and out towards the only tree that we really have in my backyard at the moment is this palm tree that's actually outside of the gate. And so we figured that this area would be a great place for the basin. So that's what I observed. You can head over to the next slide, which is step 2.
Okay, so after you observe the rain, ideally, and there was a question before we officially got started about how do you tell the level in your yard. So if it hasn't rained yet, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult, but if you have access to something fancy like a laser level, that can certainly help. A bunyip was a tool we mentioned, and we can send out a link to that, something you can make. But sometimes there's also evidence of past water flows. So if you see debris built up, if you see erosion, you can kind of read the landscape a bit to see where water has been moving. So once you have a good sense of how water is moving through your property, you're going to choose your basin location. Go to the next slide. I think this is also Lauren.
Yep. This is also mine. And so, like I said, we did not want the water to move this way. And we wanted it to move this way. And so this large circle right here, this yellow one, is where we planned to build the basin. And this, this smaller circle on the, for me, it's the left side, that is actually a berm that we created to ensure that the water coming this way through the yard does not go underneath the gate, but goes into the basin. So that was the small plan that Joaquin and I built up for my backyard.
And I really like this example that we're going to step through from Lauren's yard because it's a really small contained space and a project that was able to be done in one morning. And so it's a good example for all of you who are just getting started. We really recommend starting small and simple, and this is a great illustration of that.
Thank you. Yeah, this whole project took about 2 hours. It might have taken 2.5 hours, depending on how long I took to really decide on what we wanted to do in the backyard. But this is Joaquin helping to just kind of outline the basin. He used the back of the rake that he is holding, so he just used the handle, the end of the handle, to kind of just map out like a little bean shape into the ground to see where we were going to dig our basin. And at the moment, he is in the middle of pulling all the gravel away from the space, which is important because you don't want to it's hard enough to dig through our soils. It's even harder to dig through gravel at the same time. So.
Yeah, so if you have any existing gravel or mulch on the landscape, you'll want to pull that all back before you start digging. So step 3, digging your basin.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I also want to mention, Joaquin told me a little trick that if you kind of soak the space of where you want to dig the evening before, so you don't have to leave your water on all night, but maybe about 10 minutes or so of soaking with a hose that you have in the space that you have, it makes it a lot easier to dig that next day or whenever you're planning to dig. So soaking the ground the night before.
Exactly. The key is to do it the night before so you're not digging a muddy mess, but letting it get wet, but then waiting till the next day to dig it out.
Yeah. And so, like Lisa said, this is step 3. And so this is a time lapse, so it's got no sound, of us digging our basin basically to completion. So we can watch this for about 30 seconds. All right, so that is basin to full completion. Well, mostly that was just the digging part. And you can see we had about 4 people helping us. It was my roommate, my partner Joaquin, and I. And so we just kind of took turns going at the basin, and we dug about 6 to 8 inches deep into the ground.
And what you can see too with that little time lapse and where it's paused right now is that the extra soil went to make that berm. So they went ahead and utilized the extra soil from the basin to build up that raised earthen feature, which is on the right of that photo. So that raised earthen feature is a berm, which is going to help push water instead of going towards the gate where they don't want it to go. It's going to push water towards the basin. So that's something definitely you can think about when you're digging your basin, is where do you want that extra soil to go? Do you want to use it to create a berm somewhere else in the yard or to build up some other area of soil?
Mm-hmm. And Charlotte has a great question in the chat. Other than the berm, did you put extra soil along the fence, and why? And we did, and that was mostly because that's not where we wanted the water to overflow. We will get to overflow discussion in a little bit, but basically we did not want the water to rot out my fence in a sense, if that is possible. And so we wanted to make sure that the water went in a different direction, which we'll talk about in a bit. Great question. Oh, well, it's gonna play again.
When they're asking questions,
there we go. And so that is another photo. That's my roommate's dog, Snickers, who's right there. But he is playing around in the basin. He was very interested in what we were doing. So that's one of the photos that we got of this basin, was him running around through it. So that's the finished dug product. And now we're on to step 4.
I think I heard someone starting to ask a question. If you want to type it in the chat, we're happy to take that. So next step is plan for overflow. So if you want to skip to the next slide. So overflow is, that whole concept is your basin's going to collect some water, but what if there's more water than your basin can infiltrate? And that is likely to happen in a lot of circumstances, especially really big monsoon rain. So you always want to plan for where extra water is going to go, because if you don't plan for it, it may go somewhere you don't want it to. So you don't want it to back up against your house foundation, or let's say maybe you don't want it to go into a neighbor's yard because you really want it for another basin or a special tree. So always plan where you want your overflow to go. So how did you do that here, Lauren?
Great question. So we had just kind of decided that there really was we didn't want it to come this way towards, we have a fire pit just down the way over here in the backyard. And so we didn't necessarily want it to flood in that direction. And so we did plan the overflow to come out of the basin. And so it would kind of just flood out of this, this part and hopefully not go towards the gate, but that is kind of the direction that it is going. And so we, as rain continues to come through our area, we might change that and we might have the overflow come this way. But so far we have decided just to have it go along this way. And so this gate right here, or this part of the fence right here, is actually protected. There's lots of rocks and brick, and so that won't necessarily get too wet if the overflow does happen to come out of the basin, which was another thing that we were worried about. So that's kind of our thinking process for that.
Great. And there was a question about depth of the basin. So yeah, 6 to 8 inches is a great depth for a basin of this size. A lot of what we're teaching is just kind of depends on the context. So we are going to show some images of other basins on larger properties. And if you're doing really large scale basins, they may be deeper than that. So it just kind of depends on the context. But in a case like this, and more of like a smaller urban backyard, 6 to 8 inches is a really good depth. You want to make sure it's deep enough to capture that water in a storm where the water is building up quickly, and also room to put mulch in. We're going to be talking about that later, but you're going to have several inches of mulch in there. So the deeper the basin, the more capacity it has. But you know, you don't want to go too deeper than you need to and create a big gaping hole in your yard. So it's kind of between an aesthetic look and also like the practicality of how much water you want to catch.
Mm-hmm. And we did have a great question from Heather in the chat. How do you manipulate the basin so that the overflow goes in the direction that you want? And that is all about digging as well. So you dig in such a way that your overflow goes in that direction.
Yeah, so it's all about levels. So you want it to be the lower part of the basin. This can get a little bit complicated, but if you imagine that the top of your basin is all the same level, let's say like a bathtub. Let's imagine we're looking at a bathtub and the top is all the same level. When that bathtub fills, it's going to raise and all go over all sides equally at the same time. But if you have one part of the bathtub that has a lower lip, let's say, then the water is going to move out of that before it goes over the rest. So that's essentially how you design an overflow. So you have like all the same level at the top, but then you have one section that's lower, then that is where the water is going to go. So it has a lot to do with, like Lauren's saying, how you dig out and shape your basin.
Mm-hmm. And something that I've learned, a little trick to continue thinking about as you're digging, is water is lazy. And so that concept that Lisa was just talking about is it's going to go in the easiest place that it can. And so that's the lower area of the basin, like she was just talking about. So water is lazy and it's going to go where you want it to, as long as it's the lower part. So I think we had a few more questions in the chat. I think they were talking about rocks, which might be something that we get into a bit later.
If you go to the next photo, I think we have an example of a rocked overflow. Yeah, so this might be a little hard to see what's going on here. Amber's project has a lot of nice rock overflows in it that we'll get to look at in a little bit, but this is actually from my backyard. And there's, what you can see in the photo are two basins, one behind and one in front. And between the two basins is an overflow. So a lot of times you might direct water to go from one basin to another basin. And this is a rocked overflow. We wanted to just protect that overflow from erosion. So we did a little, and also looks kind of cool. So we did this rock structure to help protect that in a bigger storm. I'm not sure if that relates to the question that was being answered, but
yeah, they were asking about variations in size. And as far as the berm, what I did just jumping back to that. You can't really see it in this, but we did, it was covered a little better by the end, but we did cover the berm with the gravel, the extra gravel that we had from pulling it away from the basin. So just to make it cohesive with the rest of the backyard and such.
Yeah, so we're not going to get a whole lot into rock work in this workshop. And that's because we're going to teach you instead to create gentle slopes. So that's the next step. Now, there are times when you might have to have a steep slope to a basin because of limited space. Like this often happens along streets when you have a really narrow street with, you're trying to get a deeper basin in. So if you do have those constraints and you have to make the basin deep with a steep side, then you may need to rock them. So if you want to go to the next slide, this is also in our zine. It's a 3-to-1 slope that we recommend. So you can see that in this photo here. You can see that there's kind of a nice slope down, gradual slope down. It's not a steep cut. And you can just grade that out with the rake. I think there's a few more photos of that. So you can see a couple other examples.
Yep, there's the berm.
Yeah, covering the berm. Here's another example. This is from my yard. And we had a co-op workshop and everyone was helped smoothing out those sides so that it's a nice gradual slope. So for every foot of vertical, you want 3 feet of horizontal. Generally, that's a rule of thumb. And if you have that type of a slope, then you won't need to do rock work. You can just have it be soil with mulch covering it. So again, that's explained and diagrammed out in the zine. But for every, let's say, if you're going to have a 6 inches deep basin, then you need 1.5 feet of horizontal space for that slope. If that makes sense. So yes, nice gradual sides will help reduce the potential for erosion and ensure that you don't have to use a lot of rocks to help protect those slopes. Now, you certainly can use rocks. Like if you have rocks on site, if you already have gravel, you can use gravel to cover your berms. You could put it in your basins, but we really recommend organic mulch because the plants really love the organic mulch, and so do the insects and the birds. So we try not to use gravel in basins, but I suppose it'd be better than not having any mulch. So yes, so there are ways you can use gravel. Is good on like your pathways, any raised areas outside of the basins. If you want to go ahead to the next photo. All right, were there any other questions before we start talking about plants? Okay. Great. So we really want to mimic nature. We live in such an incredible place, the Sonoran Desert. There's an incredible diversity of plants, including lots of different trees. So we're going to talk about trees a bit. There's so many different types of native shrubs, pollinator plants. We love pollinator plants, so plants that would attract native butterflies, hummingbirds, bats, bees. So those are all great plants to consider in your rain garden, in your basin. If you want to go ahead and skip to the next slide. The plants we'll be talking about are the types of plants that we are giving out in our BYOB kit and are common. So between a native shade tree, we want to get as many trees in the ground as possible. If you've heard anything about the mayor's initiative, 1 million trees, we definitely want to support that, get as many trees in the ground as possible to help cool our city. And there's lots of native varieties. And so that's what we'll be handing out in our BYOB kits. Grasses. So when we're talking about grasses, we're talking about native bunch grasses. And there are a lot of non-native grasses that you see in the landscaping around Tucson, but we really want you to use native bunch grasses. So that will do best on the rainfall that we get here And I know there's probably a lot of confusion around native grasses because there's grasses we don't want, like buffalo grass, which is also a bunch grass. And just so those two things aren't confused, there are good bunch grasses, but you want to make sure you get the native variety. Accent plants, like different types of shrubs, pollinator plants, as I mentioned, and cactus. Also, we love our native cactus, and that makes incredible habitat, and it's just really beautiful. So I want to show where you put these things in relation to your basin. I think that's the next slide. Good question, Emily. I'm going to get into that a little bit. So this is a smaller street side basin, but it's a good example of where plants go. So you have your grasses can go in the bottom of the basin. They do really well being submerged in water and rainstorms. They have a lot of dense roots, so it helps reduce erosion. It helps infiltrate water quickly into the basin. Shrubs can go around the edges of the basin. They can potentially go in the basin as well. It just depends how your basin's designed. Cactus should not go in the basin. Cactus should always be on the edges or outside of the basin because cactus really don't like to have their feet wet. So you never want to put cactus in the basin. Trees, generally speaking, should be, well, it kind of varies. It depends on your type of tree, but generally speaking, you want it on the edge of the basin so that the roots can tap into the water, but that the crown of the tree is not sitting in water if it's in a deep basin. So generally on the side of the basin. There are some instances where trees can go in a basin. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So let's go ahead and move to the next. So here's a photo of a Tucson yard in action that has some rain gardens, and you can see they've done a good job with their plant placement. They have the prickly pear cactus in the front left is outside the basin. It's not sitting in the water. You can see some little bunch grasses in the basin in the water, and another shrub, which would be really hard to identify in this photo, but a native shrub is in there as well. You can see behind there's an agave outside of the basin, and then back right there's a tree, which maybe is a mesquite, hard to tell in this photo, but you can see it's right next to the basin, so its true roots are going to tap into all that water. You can go to the next slide. Here's a yard from the Phoenix area. These are much larger basins and actually quite deep. They get a lot of storm water from their neighborhood moving into their property. So these basins really help prevent their house from flooding. In this case, they have not really planted a whole lot in the basins, and this water might be 1.5 feet to 2 feet deep. So they're pretty deep basins, but you can see all around they've got wildflowers, they've got lots of native shrubs, they have some beautiful trees. So in this case, this is an instance of a much bigger, deeper basin that gets a lot of water. They could definitely put bunch grasses in that basin. There's probably some shrubs that would do okay as well. And next slide. So this photo is from the Living Lab and Learning Center. So hopefully you all will get a chance to go over there and look at the basins on our property. And we have a variety of basins. We have the street side ones. We have these kind of terraced basins in this photo. And then there's kind of any basin you can imagine, some with rocks, some without. So you get to see a lot of different examples. I wanted to show you this because you can see kind of the density of plants in these terraced basins. So we've got this bunch grass right in the basin. You can see wildflowers are in there. Towards the top, it's like a two steps of basins here. On the top, we've got the prickly pear, the agave, and some mugwort, which is a super cool native shrub. And that mugwort actually can be on the side or in a basin as well. It does well in the basins. In the back left, there's a mesquite tree that's kind of on the side of the basin. It's somewhat newly planted, not leafed out in this photo, but definitely you're going to get to see a lot of good examples when you come by the Living Lab. I think this is the last photo in the series. Is there any others? Okay, yeah, so before we get to this slide, if we can go back, I think there were some questions that came in.
Yeah, so I think one is about, there's a couple that were about like how many plants can you put around a basin? Is that going to affect the infiltration of the basin overall? I think that's a good question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think really look to nature. If you haven't gotten out around the mountains in Tucson, get out and see what it looks like. See how close plants are to each other. Tucson Mountains, the Catalina Mountains, the Rincon Mountains, I would get out at the lower elevations because that's going to be more like your yard versus higher elevations is not so much like what urban Tucson's like, but just notice how close plants are to each other. What can the natural desert rainfall support? So I think in an area where you're concentrating water in a basin, you can definitely support a higher density of plants. You'll also want to consider how big the mature size of that plant is. So when you get the plant, it's kind of small, but those bunch grasses can get 3 to 4 feet in diameter. Same with these shrubs. They may come in a little 1 gallon pot. Some of them may get to be 6 feet by 6 feet. So you also want to think about the size of the plant and how many you might fit in or around a basin. There's a whole nother side of this, which we're not going to really get into in detail in this workshop, but you can also design how many plants based on your water budget. So this is something that is in the zine. There's a little calculator for you to calculate how much rain you might get off your roof. In a rainfall event and an annual rainfall. And then there's all sorts of resources out there that help you determine, okay, if you get this amount of rain, these are the plants you can support. So those of you who maybe have more engineering minds might like to geek out on that type of thing. But generally speaking, I would say for like an average size kind of small medium basin of, let's say, 6 feet by 6 feet, that would probably support 1 native tree, like a velvet mesquite or a desert ironwood. Those trees do eventually get to be about 25 feet tall. And so again, you want to consider the mature size of those trees when you're planning out the location of the trees next to other trees or shrubs. But in a basin, kind of like I was describing, 6 feet by 6 feet, maybe 6 inches to 10 inches deep, you can definitely support a native shade tree, a number of shrubs, probably like 4 or 5 bunch grasses, several native shrubs, and then cactus. You know, you don't need a basin for cactus. We just love cactus, and so you want to put them in as habitat, but those don't need any extra rain.
I'm seeing a question about a list of native bunch grasses. I think that later in the presentation, Lisa has a few. Another great thing to do is also just go to nurseries who specialize in local plants, such as Desert Survivors. They have a great selection of native bunch grasses, and they will tell you all about them. And then in this lab photo, is all of the growth seen in this photo basin driven, or is there irrigation as well?
Oh, such a good question. There is no drip irrigation on these plants. So this is all dependent on rainfall. Same with the previous the 2 other photos. Now one of those was a pretty new landscape, but that's pretty common. Yeah, so those plants also on both of those sites are not getting drip irrigation. So that's a common way that WMG designs landscapes, is to have the plants entirely supported by rainwater, potentially gray water if we're doing like fruit trees. We are going to talk about the need to irrigate to get established, but you can definitely, with native plants and a rain basin, plant it without a drip irrigation system. And again, think about what you see in nature. If you go out for a hike, and the arroyos, the creeks, and the low mountain desert, what plants do you see out there? They are not on a drip irrigation system. So they are surviving just on the rainfall. So that really can help us tune into what we can grow.
They're all stone cold. Great.
Any other questions before we move on?
I think there's one more question for right now. There's another question about trees, but I'll bring that up when we get to the trees. In this picture right now, someone has said there's a lot of rocks in this basin. And I will say that if you kind of look at the base of the gray plant, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, and the bottom, you can see that there's actually quite a large slope in between these two basins, right? And so these rocks are not creating the basins, so to say, so much as preventing that very steep slope from eroding over time. So that had to do with the landscape before the basins were dug, yes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so it is a little hard to see what's happening in this photo, but that's where I was using the word terrace. This particular part of our property has a lot of slope. And so we did have to actually build some rock terraces to prevent erosion in this area. But you don't normally have to do that if you have a small amount of slope in your yard. It's just, this might be a practice if you have a yard with a lot of slope that you may need to build some terraces. All right, so native trees. We are providing native shade trees through our BYOB kits. The trees that we are sourcing include desert ironwood, velvet mesquite, blue palo verde, and canyon hackberry. We might also have some desert willows. Now, we can't guarantee you any particular tree when you come pick up your kit. You're going to get one of these. It's possible there may be a couple to choose from, but it's possible you may just have one to pick up. So,
hackberry is one of the options I could get.
I'm sorry, was that a question?
Okay. Asking if they could get hackberry, and to reinforce Lisa's point, the answer is there may be hackberries available. And if they are, you are allowed to technically choose that one. But we cannot promise that any one of these will be available when you come to pick up your kit.
Right. And in fact, there's not a whole lot of canyon hackberries we're finding out there. So if you're really wanting a canyon hackberry, you might have to go source one yourself at a nursery, because we're not able to get our hands on that many of those. But these are all amazing trees. They all do really well in Tucson. They all get large to provide shade. They definitely all have thorns. So yay, thorns. Yay, we're in the desert. Time to embrace the thorns. That's just the reality of being in the desert. So yes, just be aware of that. Some have smaller, some have larger, but they're wonderful trees. This is a photo of a desert ironwood here on the left. That's really my favorite native tree. They get to be quite large. And if they're getting extra rainwater, they grow at a decent clip. So the velvet mesquite and the blue palo verde tend to grow a little bit faster. But again, depending on how much rainwater they're getting, they'll grow. I would say if you take home a 5-gallon tree this year, again, depending on how much rain they're getting, they may start shading in a significant way in 3 to 5 years. So it does take a little bit of patience. It is an investment, but the really cool thing about these trees is that they do survive on our rainfall. They don't need a lot of supplemental irrigation, really not any. They'll just grow a little bit faster if they're getting rainwater in a basin. Ironwoods are known to be a really long-lived tree. So if you want to plant a tree that your grandkids will benefit from, or someone in the family line way down the way, or future Tucsonans, plant a desert ironwood. They last for hundreds of years. It's such a cool tree. Has beautiful purple flowers once it starts to be a little bit more mature. The other cool thing is these all are edible. You can actually harvest the pods from desert ironwoods, velvet mesquite, blue palo verdes. Not sure about canyon hackberry, but at least the first 3, those all have edible pods. So really cool thing to have some edible food that's coming with these shade trees as well.
Lisa, if you have power lines over where you want to plant, where your basin is going, what trees would you recommend, if any, because that might be a problem?
Yeah, so these trees will get to about 25, 30 feet tall. So if your power lines are below that level, then you might consider some smaller trees, like an acacia is a smaller tree. I'm trying to think what else is a little bit smaller.
This isn't going to be completely, you would probably need supplemental irrigation for this, but they do give them through Trees for Tucson, and that is the pomegranate trees.
Mhm.
They also tend to not get very large. They are a fruit tree, so they will very likely need supplemental irrigation if you want any fruit.
Mhm.
But if you don't care about that, maybe it would be okay.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. That's a nice screening tree too, and doesn't get quite as large. Other questions about trees? I think we're going to talk about planting trees next. So this is a little screenshot of the zine. So you will get this information if you don't have it yet. But you do want to really think about your technique for tree planting. It does make a difference in the health of the tree. And hopefully you have a good specimen of a tree from the nursery. We're pretty confident in the nurseries we're sourcing our trees from, but you're going to want to dig out a hole that is wider than the size of the tree, but not deeper. You want the tree, when it comes out of the pot, to be level with the soil around it. And you can see under step 4 there showing the root crown, you want that to be slightly above the level of the soil. You don't want it to be below. And that root crown needs oxygen, and that's why you don't want it to get buried by dirt. So you do want to be really gentle with that tree as you're pulling it out of the pot, and pay close attention to the roots. If there's a lot of bound roots, you might need to break them apart at the bottom. But if the trees feels like maybe it's starting to fall, the root ball is starting to fall apart, you just want to very carefully handle that to protect as much of the roots as possible. All right. We're going to start talking about mulch. This might be one of my favorite topics. And maybe Amber's too. So we love mulch, and we really love organic mulch. And so you're seeing a photo here. This is Joaquin. This is a project from his yard. If you saw the 6-minute video, this was his basin project. You see here the basin without mulch. Then next photo, you have the mulch added over the basin. So this is a really important part. You definitely want to have mulch with your basin. You do not want to create a rain garden without mulch. You're going to get a lot of erosion. So that's the #1 problem. When it rains, you're going to see a lot of erosion. And then the other piece that mulch does is it really protects the soil from evaporation. So we have very hot spring, summer, fall, and that direct sunlight really bakes the soil and it evaporates a lot of the moisture. So the mulch will help keep the moisture in the soil, which will make your plants a lot happier. The cool thing about organic mulch, as opposed to gravel, is in addition to protecting the soil and shading the soil, it also adds nutrients back into the soil. And that's so important for the health of your plants. It's important for the whole ecosystem you're creating with this rain garden. Things like birds, if you're a bird fan, I know a lot of us here in the urban setting like birds in our backyard. Birds are often trying to find insects, and it's way easier for them to access insects in the soil in a mulch basin than trying to dig through gravel. So there's so many reasons why we like organic mulch. Another reason is you can get it for free. So you will be getting mulch through your BYOB kit, but also all your plants just naturally create mulch. So if you're in the habit of raking or sweeping or collecting that material that may be falling from your plants, now's the time to start changing that habit and using it in your basins. If you don't want it all over your yard, that's fine. Maybe just concentrate it in your basins, and the plants will really appreciate having those extra nutrients and ground cover. This is a photo from my yard, that workshop with the co-op, and I just wanted you to see a couple other looks at what what mulch can look like. So we pretty much have put mulch across our entire landscape. We love it so much. So it's in the basins, it's on the berms, it's on the pathways, pretty much everywhere. We did use 2 different types of mulch just to visually distinguish between that area. That was more of an aesthetic choice. But in the basins, you definitely want 2 to 3 inches of mulch. And then elsewhere in your yard, it's just, again, a nice way to protect the soil. It's going to keep more moisture. So even if you don't have any basins, you can put mulch over your yard, and that's going to help conserve water in your yard. You won't have to irrigate your plants as much, and it's just going to create a much healthier backyard habitat. So some questions that are coming in.
Yeah, I see one question from Cheryl. How concerned do we need to be about scorpions with organic mulch? I think we had this question last time, and I think the answer was not very concerned, but I'll let Lisa
Yeah, there's no correlation between scorpions and organic mulch, as far as I know. So I think, scorpions are going to be found somewhere regardless. They're not coming in with the mulch. So scorpions can hide under rocks, gravel, mulch, whatever it is. So I don't think it makes a difference whether it's organic mulch or other materials.
Yes, this is a very common concern with mulch is scorpions, and there has been a lot of actual debunking showing that mulch doesn't increase the number of scorpions in your yard. It might just have them, they were already there, is the short story. They were already in your yard, they were already hanging out, and maybe now that you're more involved in seeing all this mulch, you might see them a little bit more often. But it does not attract scorpions. It doesn't bring any more than already existed out there. Another question here about mulch is, how do you prevent weeds and wildflowers from popping up? Through the mulch. And mulch itself, I believe, is naturally pretty suppressant, especially if it's thick enough, right? Because weeds and wildflowers need sun, and they can't really push their way up through it if it's there. So that will, as long as your mulch is thick enough, and we recommend, 2 to 3 inches of mulch, that should naturally suppress a lot of those. And then there's a question of how often you need to replace the mulch. And I don't know.
So it's kind of depends on your landscape. We tend to add more mulch every 1 to 3 years. Also, because we just love mulch so much, we just want there to be a lot of it. But you will kind of see that it does start to break down over time. And so, yeah, every couple of years, it's nice to add more. But like I'm saying, if you plan that into your landscape, like your mesquite trees, your ironwoods, your shrubs are naturally going to drop leaves. You're going to need to do some pruning. So we recommend chop and drop. So instead of putting that stuff in the garbage or out for brush and bulky, chop it up and put it in your basin. So you can kind of replenish your own mulch. But if you're just getting started and there's not a lot of organic material already on your property, then yeah, you might need to bring in more mulch every year, 2 to 3 years to kind of build that up at the beginning. I have a photo here on the right of a tree trimming company, Romeo Tree Service. So this is definitely a good option, is to call up some of the tree trimming companies in town. Maybe there's one you've seen in your neighborhood. They are constantly chipping woody material, and a lot of times they bring it to the dump and they have to pay for that. So if you can get a connection with one of them and say, we'd love for you to drop off your next load at our yard, then you can get a nice source of free mulch. Now, this is not going to be like a super uniform looking mulch, likely, because they're mulching a lot of different things. So you can't be too picky about what you get. And there may be thorns in there. So just know that it's going to be a somewhat mixed bag on what you get, but it's definitely a great source of free mulch that you can tap into.
Can you add compost to a basin, Lisa?
You can, but you don't need to. I would save your compost for fruit trees, veggie gardens. Yeah, there's not really much of a need. I mean, it's not really going to hurt anything. So you can, but there's, yeah, the plants don't need it. The native plants don't need it. Good question. I'm seeing the mulch you're getting from the Living Lab is a mulch from Tank's Green Stuff. It's a professional produced product. So no, it does not have any thorns in it. It's a uniform shape, more uniform product. It looks quite nice. Okay. So step 8, observe and adjust. So this is a process, it's a learning process. Part of the fun is getting out and seeing how your basin is working in the rain. So when that first rainstorm you get, you'll be running out and looking at everything and seeing how it all works. And you may end up making adjustments in the rain, which I have definitely done myself out in the rainstorm with my shovel, like, that's not quite what I wanted, and making new pathways for the water. So be prepared to do that. It's super fun. And it's okay to make mistakes with this. It's a learning process. And again, you just get out and you adjust. The water's going in a way you don't want it to. Then you can start to adjust your slopes, your berms. And I think also really observing your plants is an important thing, because this is a living system. And you're going to need to pay attention to how the plants are doing. The weather's always changing. The weather's not uniform. This year has been a really dry year. Past winters, we've had some really wet years. So depending on, when you take home this kit and you plant your plants, if we don't get any rain between now and the monsoon, you're going to have to really baby your plants and give them some extra water. If we get a couple of rainstorms, it's going to make it a lot easier. But that's something you're really going to want to pay attention to is your plants and what's happening with the weather, in terms of, do you need to adjust how you're watering them? I think that might be the next slide. So watering schedule, I'm trying to remember. Yes. Okay, so this is also in your zine. There's a basic watering schedule for getting native plants established. Keep in mind, this is for trees, shrubs, and grasses. This is not for cactus. So you also can take home some prickly pear cuttings, some cactus pups. This watering schedule does not apply to them. They pretty much don't need water. So don't overwater your cactus. So yeah, and if you're thinking about that velvet mesquite tree or that pollinator plant or that grass, in the first 2 weeks, you're going to water deeply right after you plant, and every 2 to 3 days. If it's supposed to be 90 degrees later this week, if it's hitting 90 plus degrees right after you plant, you may want to water every day for the first week. So pay close attention to what's happening with the weather. Then during the summer and monsoon, you're going to water 2 times per week, unless it's raining, and then you can skip some watering. In the fall, winter, and spring, you can then move to watering 1 time per week. Again, if it's raining, then you can skip that watering because they'll have enough. We go into the second year, and you can start to reduce that 1 time a week in the summer monsoon, 1 to 2 times per month in the rest of the year. Again, adjusting for rainfall. And then the third year and beyond, maybe monthly if needed during dry summer months. So it could be you don't need to water at all if we have kind of average rainfall. If we're in a really long, hot, dry period, you might need to supplement a little bit. So really what you're doing is you're helping this, what's been in a pot, move into the ground and establish a root system, and that takes time. So you do have to provide some supplemental water to help transition it from that pot phase to being well-established root system in the ground. I think I've seen a bunch of questions come in. So Amber or Lauren, what do we got?
Okay, so one of the questions was, how quickly do the trees need to be planted once they get them from the BYOB pickup?
Yeah, you can keep them in the pot for, you could probably keep them in the pot for 6 months. they're just going to be, you're going to be watering them a lot more if you just keep them in a pot. But yeah, they'll be fine in the pot for a while. I would, because you'll be getting them in early April, this is a great time to plant. The longer you wait, the harder it is to get the plant established without a lot of water. So if you wait to plant to June, that's really not a great time to plant because it's so hot. The plant's going to be really stressed. So I would just say get it in the ground as soon as you can, but ultimately it will be fine in the pot for many months.
Another question is, how much water do we need during a deep watering session versus a regular watering session?
Good question. I think that language is just really meant to like give it a really good soak. Like when you're getting that plant in the ground, don't skim that first once or twice you water. Just really give it a deep soak. You do want the water to move all the way through the soil down to like the base of the roots. So if you have a 5-gallon pot, you know, maybe it's a foot deep, just imagine, picture that water. If you just, you know, sprinkle a little water on the top, it's not going to get through to all the roots. So you want to have that water slowly soaking in enough so it's moving that foot down the soil and saturating the roots and the soil around the roots.
And then I think the final question is, well, there's more coming, but Mike is saying the 5-gallon bucket system is brilliant. You basically fill a 5-gallon bucket, you allow it to slowly flow over the tree, so you know you're getting that much water and it's going slowly and deeply into the tree. Another question was, and we can get to this later, but is if we want to do curb cutting, is there a link or resources for getting curbs cut, basically?
Yeah, so we actually have a whole entire very detailed manual on doing green stormwater infrastructure. I don't know if Lauren or Amber, you can dig that link up from our website. It's in our resource library. But there is definitely a whole different process around designing. We call it green infrastructure, but same idea, rain gardens, basins along streets. And that's because this is a space that's shared between the city and the private property owner. You have to meet all the city's requirements. You do need to get it permitted. So you will need to have a design that you take to the city to get permitted. And that's including like how the curb cut's done. So we can drop a link into that of our manual on green infrastructure. Should we move on? Did we get all the questions?
Yes, I will look for that link.
Okay. But now you're talking, Amber, so
No,
maybe Lauren can look for it
instead.
So yeah, so Amber is going to talk a little bit about her yard, and we have a cool video to share, a project that was recently done and just learning from her experience.
Yes, so this is a picture from the street, basically, of my yard looking, as you can see, back into my house. To Dawn's question, she just asked, does WGM offer help with design process? Yes, this is a service that they do offer, and I actually took it up and had them help me design this area of my yard. So that's something that is available through their website. I'll put the link up too, that WGM does offer. But this is just to show sort of, this can get as big or as small as you want. You can have one basin, you can have, I think I have 9 basins. I wanted a lot of basins, so I got a lot of basins. So what we're looking at in the very front of the picture is a mulched in basin right off the road. So this is capturing a lot of the runoff from the road. And then my front yard is very sloped. And so it's very easy to tell that it's sloped. And so what we've done is we've connected all of these basins sort of down this slope to capture as much water as possible. There are rocks, because I know people were worried about rocks. And you can see that those rocks connect, basically the 2 connection points of 2 adjacent basins, and that's to prevent erosion. Because those places are narrower, they're gonna get more water flow. It's still a bit hard to see because they haven't leafed out. This was done in February. So the native trees we planted are doing good, but they haven't leafed out completely. So they do look a little bit like sticks, but you can see we've planted numerous stick-looking trees that are beginning to get leaves. I'm very excited. So I followed the watering schedule. They've been very happy. And now they're starting to leaf out. I have some cactus. I have many shrubs that were planted all along this. And so depending on what your yard looks like, you can make this as big or as small as you want. So this is the video. We got it sort of mid-process, sort of mid-dig, and you can see at the top the basins are finished, sort of near the road. You can see the mulch is clean, and they kind of did the berms with the gravel. And as we go down the hill, what you'll see is that they were still being dug, and so they aren't as clean looking, but it just sort of shows the process of everything. And you can see how many basins I had. To be honest, highly doubt that all of these will ever be completely full. But if it ever happened, I will get a video of it, and I will be so excited. But they do help collect water from the yard itself as well as off of the road. So we haven't had a big storm yet, so I haven't been able to test it, but we will. And this is one of the volunteers, because this was done at a co-op. He's helping do some rock work. He's a good friend of my husband, so my husband was a little bit getting up in his business with the drone. So we don't need to. We can continue watching if you want to see what he's doing.
Amber, have you seen a rainfall event with this new landscape?
Yes, but the rainfall event was about 0.2 inches. And so you could tell it was wet, but I haven't had enough rain since then for it to be, for there to be water visible in the basins, right? Like you could see that it was in the mulch, but it's never overcome the mulch.
Cool.